Hey everyone, welcome to Power and Status. Today we're going to be talking about those foundational concepts of the course. So I really want to kind of get into what we as social scientists mean by power and what we mean by status, and then a little bit about how power works. Basically, to start things off, as the sociologist Stephen Lukes reminds us, power is a dispositional concept. It is a disposition that an individual has to wield power or not to wield power, and to wield it successfully or to wield it but not be successful. We have a tendency to think about power as only existing where it has been exercised successfully. So in sort of everyday speech, we talk about powerful people, and we have a clear understanding in our minds about the moments and the methods that they use to wield power successfully. But what Lukes says is that, hold on a second, people have power, whether they're successful or not, that's a separate question. So when we talk about power, we're really talking about a disposition. Someone may have a powerful disposition, that is, they're in a position or a place where they're able to have a higher probability of having their needs and their goals met, but they're not assured of that. All right, so Max Weber, the German sociologist, defined power as the probability of a person or a group to realize their own will against the resistance of others. And I think as we're going to go through this a little bit, you're going to find out that whether or not somebody actively resists is an important question that we should think about. Another fallacy that Lukes pointed to is called what he called the vehicle fallacy. And that is that he reminded us that power is not the same as the tools or resources used to gain compliance. So we typically think about people who are powerful as having these tools of power. You can think about the coercive power of military or police. And just to be very clear about what power means, Lukes is telling us, we need to be distinct here. Just because you have the tools of power doesn't mean you necessarily have power, and vice versa. We should always consider power in its complexity too. And so this brings up questions like, well, if I don't do anything, if I'm simply complicit, or if I'm simply if I'm a powerful person and I choose not to act, is that, or can that be considered an act of power also? And so we should think about inaction as possibly an expression of power at times. To complicate the issue even further, does power involve intention? In other words, powerful people may be exercising power, but they're doing it in kind of a habitual manner. That is, they're going through the motions of what they think they ought to do, perhaps, of what they've been told by someone else that they ought to do. But they haven't really thought for themselves and are not acting fully with their own intentions. So in a sense, are they then exercising power? Or is that something else? These are all questions that we should keep in mind as we kind of explore this concept of power. To begin the discussion, I want to focus on three different arenas, or some people might say structures, within which power is typically expressed, organized, and where these hierarchies that are based on power, powerful people at the top, less powerful people at the bottom, are expressed. And those three arenas or structures are what Max Weber pointed out as class, status, and party. So if we begin with class, what does class refer to? People become hierarchically organized in a class structure based on economic power, right? So a social class is basically going to have people who are rich at the top and people who are poor at the bottom. And what's important to keep in mind here at this point is that people within a class hierarchy are organized in a way, not just based on, you can think about that organization as a hierarchy, but it's not simply a hierarchy. There's also an activity that one can expect from that hierarchy, and that is that the people at the top are going to act in ways that shore up or reaffirm the structure that has benefited them so much, right? So the people who celebrate capitalism, the capitalist economy, which is the formal structure, the economic system within which our class-based structure operates, the people at the top of that system are the ones who are going to fight to maintain that system in its place, to make sure that it works in the way that continually benefits them. Because if we were to suddenly drop capitalism, say we implemented socialism or communism or some other economic system, then you'd have a complete reorganization, because the thing that identifies people at the top of that hierarchy would no longer be the same. The game would change, right? You go from a basketball court to a badminton court, the rules are different, and there's going to be new people who come to the top as the new winners, and then some of the people at the top are going to fall to the bottom as the losers. The second structure in which power hierarchically organizes itself is status, and Max Weber pointed to this as well. Basically, in a status system, it's typically involving a community of people who are hierarchically organized based on an estimation of their honor. So if the principle that distinguishes people in a class-based system is wealth and income, the principle that distinguishes people in a status-based system is honor. A common mistake that people often make is that status is the same thing as class, or that it's even functionally the same thing. And that's not quite the case. And I want to make a distinction here. So if you think about a public safety organization, say the police, you think about, this is a tight community. The public safety community is often a very tight community. And within that community, there are recognizable symbols of status. And as I said before, this has to do with honor, right? So within a public safety committee, what would be considered honorable? And what I would point out is that one thing that's considered very honorable, particularly in a public safety community, particularly in a law enforcement community, is one's willingness to put their life on the line to save others. I would say that that's valued pretty high. At all costs, I'm going to run into a burning building to save these people who I know are still alive in there. And at great risk to themselves, they put themselves in harm's way. In the case of a firefighter, and he or she runs into a building, saves a person, that person will gain honor. They gain status. And it's possible that they don't necessarily have high class, right? So they might not even be formally promoted in the organization. They can come back to work the next day, and they're not necessarily going to be elevated in terms of what their official ranking is, but their friends and their colleagues are going to kind of pat them on the shoulder. They're going to think of them as a true firefighter. And that is an elevation in their status that doesn't necessarily have an elevation, isn't necessarily accompanied by an elevation in their income. And so you can see that the way that status and class aren't always working in concert with each other. The last structure that Max Weber points to is party. And this includes associations such as unions. A teachers' union is a typical one, but any labor union. This is where people come together who have some kind of a common condition, like a profession or an interest in a particular topic, and they come together for the purposes of gaining some measure of power and prestige within a political system. You can, of course, think of formal political parties like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. That's also would be included, but just wanted to point out that in Max Weber's understanding of the term party, he's really talking about associations more broadly and not specifically political parties. So one last thing that I want to just point out is that it's important when thinking about these structures of power to understand that there is a degree of what's called fungibility between these structures. So although they are in tension with one another, I talked a little bit about how status doesn't necessarily translate to class. If somebody is high status, they're not necessarily high class. And if they're high class, such as someone who wins the lottery, but they've lived their entire lives in low income housing, they're not necessarily going to have status, but they'll be very rich. Um, these can be mismatched, but they're also fungible. In other words, that person who has just won the lottery can use that money to buy their way into certain organizations or societies that elevate them in terms of status, or they can perhaps afford the ability to enter into groups and organizations in Max Weber's understanding of a party, uh, in order to take on an extra degree of power. And so this fungibility, the idea that you can take resources you have from one of these arenas, one of these structures, and you can apply them or pay them into another structure in order to elevate your standing within that other structure and in the hierarchy of that other structure, that's also a part of these structures of power. Moving on from the structures of power, what I want to talk about briefly now are three dimensions of power or three faces of power. Stephen Lukes outlines these dimensions of power in his work, but the first one is the most obvious one. It's the one that you can see, frankly, a lot of recently, and that is coercive power, or the power of violence. And what coercive power is really referring to is that probability that someone will successfully and intentionally coerce you to do what they want with violence or the threat of violence. If you don't do this, I will hit you. Or if you won't do this, I will kill you. If you don't move, I will shoot tear gas in your direction. This is, as I said, the most obvious sort of power. When a state or an organization is exercising this kind of power, you know it's happening. You can see it. And that's why a lot of theorists, power theorists, tend to think of this power as a sign of weakness, because it is kind of a power of the last resort often. It's much more effective to be able to rely on the second two types of power. And of those, the second one is agenda setting, or you can also include in there something called framing. And so this is the probability that someone will successfully set the agenda of what is even possible to be discussed. So for example, you can decide which topics are up for consideration and debate and which ones never even make it onto the table. A good example of agenda setting would be the recent discussion of defund the police. For many, many years, a number of communities who weren't feeling that they were being served very well by the police have called for defund the police. You know, what is this organization doing except terrorizing my community, was often the response from folks in these communities, particularly in African American communities. And defund the police, though, if you'll remember, not so long ago, was absolutely something that was never even uttered. It didn't even come up in conversations. We've long talked about reforms, but we never talked about defund the police. And now you can see how that topic has moved onto the agenda, and people who had never even thought about it are beginning to even consider it. That is an example of agenda setting and how that topic was for a very long time even kept out of the realm of public discussion. It wasn't reported on, although people were talking about it. And there was a shift, though, in public frustration in recent years that allowed that topic to kind of become put on the table and discussed. The second idea that I referred to is framing. So you've got agenda setting and framing. Framing is really how we talk about the issue. And so what I would point out here is conversations recently, for example, like on healthcare. And you can really just flip back and forth between, say, Fox News and CNN News and see how these different news organizations are effectively competing not just for ratings, but how to actually frame issues. And you can see here, for example, Fox News talking about healthcare initiatives which have been pushed forward by President Biden as the radical left-wing agenda for healthcare, and CNN talking about the healthcare agenda pushed forward by Joseph Biden as a humanitarian sort of response to a need in the country. How we talk about an issue will have everything to do with whether we do anything about that issue. And so it's interesting to see how different organizations will frame issues in order to influence how we talk about it. Now, the last dimension of power is a little bit more difficult. It's a little bit more subtle. And so if coercion is the most obvious, this last idea is going to be the least obvious. Basically, this last dimension of power refers to the probability that someone will successfully shape another person's desires and their beliefs, so that you don't have to convince them, you don't have to coerce them, and you don't have to persuade them through framing and agenda setting. So I'm going to give you a quick example, and this is an example I'm taking from the work of a social theorist named Foucault. And Foucault, a French theorist, was drawing from another theorist, philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and Jeremy Bentham had come up with this idea of what he called a panopticon. And the panopticon is a tower that sat in the middle of a prison yard, and just outside around the tower was constructed the actual cells, so that the openings of each cell where the bars are was facing the tower. And what this meant is that a guard could go up into the tower and could stand in the tower and have a clear line of sight into every single cell of every single prisoner in the prison. At all times, prisoners could be watched. And once that they'd constructed this architecture, they realized that what they could do would be to tint the windows, and you could, through the way that you do lighting, you could put light a candle outside of the window that would create a reflection against the glass. And so that the prisoners were no longer even able to tell whether the guard was inside the tower looking at them or not, or whether the guard maybe was looking at someone else. And so to the prisoners, they took on over time this sense, this looming sense that they were always being watched. And what the guards then could effectively do would be not to show up to the tower at all. They just needed to light that candle, because the prisoners would never even know if somebody was in the tower. And the key point, again, to keep in mind here is that there was a realization that the prisoners began to internalize the sense that they were always being watched. And with that internalized sense, they began to change their everyday habits. In order to show that there was no reason to be suspicious, they would engage in all of the activities in their cells in a way that they were always facing towards the tower. And so they would change just the way that they even moved, where they stood, how they acted. Again, always with the assumption that they were always being watched. And if we take this almost as a metaphor or a paradigm and think about it in terms of modern society, you can think of surveillance cameras. And in DC several years ago, I don't think it's the case any longer, but really who knows, surveillance cameras often weren't working. But it didn't really matter, because just seeing that camera there would prevent people from running a red light. They didn't know whether it was working or not. They just sort of assumed that it was. And so it gained a kind of, it forced residents to internalize a kind of conformity that they hadn't internalized before. There were people who would just automatically slow down on the accelerator, lift up on the accelerator and slow down on particular roads, because after a few months of, getting tickets or seeing a security camera, they knew that they they needed to drive a particular way. And what's key here is that they no longer had to think about it. They just did it. It became a part of their muscle memory. And the idea here is that, again, that we navigate through life with this kind of muscle memory. We conform. And not only do we conform in how we behave, we adopt ideas that help justify why we behave in that way. It's good to drive slow because this neighborhood has a lot of children, for example, is a justification that we might tell ourselves. Probably it's a right justification, but it is a justification nonetheless. And now if you think about a system of power maintaining itself, if we kind of leave traffic behind and go to a more serious example, there are similar justifications for why we believe rich people are right to be rich. We tend to think that they're harder workers than poor people, for example. Those are all beliefs that we've internalized, even those of us who have not benefited from capitalism. The poorest of us tend to adopt the view that rich people basically deserve to be rich because they work very hard. I can tell you as a sociologist, empirically, that's not true. Rich people sometimes work hard and sometimes they don't. They're rich because they're very fortunate.